Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar, Greenhouse Gas Inventory, Tips and Troubleshooting. Today we're going to hear from Brett Pasinella, Senior Manager of Innovative Services. At the end we will have some time for questions and answers. Please remember that you can submit questions for the Q&A at any time using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. This webinar will be recorded and the recording and slides will be shared in the days following this presentation. And now I'm going to leave you with Brett Pasinella.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the webinar. We just have a few slides today going over some of the background of conducting a greenhouse gas inventory and giving a few tips. This isn't really a webinar for learning how to do a greenhouse gas inventory in a lot of detail. We're just going to go over some of the basics and some of the tips and tricks that you might find useful as you're conducting your inventory. So please, if you have any questions, let us know and we'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. I'd just like to thank all of the corporate sponsors of Second Nature and all of our partners for making our work possible. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to start out with going through a few of the new additions about the climate commitments in Second Nature. You may have seen some of this in our webinars previously, but I just want to keep repeating it probably for the next year or so, 6 months at least, to get everyone familiar with some of the changes that we've made. If you would want more detail about these changes, since I'm not going to spend very much time on it at all, you can watch several of the last 2 or 3 webinars that we've done are available on our Second Nature website, and you can go and watch the videos from those, and they go into a lot of detail about the new commitments, the resilience commitment, and the climate leadership commitment, and how that is different from the carbon commitment and formerly the ACU PCC. So what were the major changes? Why did we change? Well, it's been almost 10 years since the commitment was first created, and there is a lot of changes in what it means to be a climate leader now, and especially the capacity to adapt and respond to the aspects of climate change that we're already seeing now. So the full commitment includes work both on climate mitigation and carbon neutrality. Is still a very important aspect of sustainability work, but also working on adaptation, resilience, preparedness. Those aspects of the climate action are also becoming increasingly important. So those have been added to the commitments. And some of our goals for doing that were the same types of goals we were after when we created the ACU PCC 10 years ago. But we've learned a lot from the network in that time. And so we've, done some things to help streamline implementation, to highlight the work that's been done by our campuses in the last 10 years, and to really continue to provide, the transformative action that's needed in higher ed to address the climate issue. So we have 3 commitments now. The carbon commitment, which was formerly the ACU PCC. So if you are a signatory of the ACU PCC, you are now a signatory of the carbon commitment, and no action is required on your part. Just all signatories of the ACU PCC are now carbon commitment signatories. And the resilience commitment focuses on some actions in resilience, the creation of a sustainability committee that involves members from the community outside of the campus, working in partnership with your local community, doing vulnerability assessments, doing some scenarios planning around, what types of areas would you like to work on to make your community more resilient, and developing some indicators and reporting on those indicators of resilience. And literally, if you were to take the 2 of those commitments and combine them together, you would have the new climate leadership commitment. So if you're a signatory of ACU PCC and you'd like to start doing some resilience work, or you have been doing some resilience work and you'd like to formally commit to it in the form of the climate leadership's commitment, you would become a signatory of the climate commitment, since you are already a signatory of the carbon commitment. And if you're not signatory and you're looking to get into this type of work, you could join any three of these. If you wanted to work on resilience and mitigation in concert, you could sign the climate commitment. Or if you wanted to work on either of those issues individually, you could sign one of the other carbon or resilience commitments. So this just sort of illustrates the change. You know, in the old ACU PCC model, we had the commitment itself, which was called ACU PCC, and then we had the network of signatories, which was also called the ACU PCC. So that was slightly confusing. And now it's a little bit more clear, and having, you know, we have the three climate leadership commitments, and any signatory of any one of those three commitments is part of our climate leadership network. So moving on to the topic of today's webinar, just want to give a brief overview of, you know, what is an inventory, what are some of the things that you're going to find in an inventory, and what are some you know, tips and things like that that will help you to conduct your inventory as you move through this year and get coming closer to the reporting deadline on January 15th. So the first thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the purpose of an inventory is broader than just sort of something that you have to complete and report. The focus should not really be on reporting and you know, oh, this is the you know, the chore that I have to do because I'm a signatory. It's really supposed to be a tool for dynamic assessment of your campus, of sort of how are you doing, you know, where are we going and where are we now, and sort of understanding your campus and how it works, and what are some potential paths towards moving towards carbon neutrality, and what are some of the sort of low-hanging fruit, easiest steps that you could take to get there. So the primary purposes of the inventory are, you know, number one is a management tool. It helps you identify, you know, what are some of your biggest sources of emissions? What are some things that you could work on that would have the biggest impact on your carbon footprint overall? It helps you track progress from year to year. This is why it's important to you know, conduct an inventory on an annual basis. You can see the impact of the policies and projects that you've implemented in the previous year. You can understand if you're on the right track, or you know, if maybe those projects or policies were not as effective as you hoped they would be, and it's time to reevaluate and do some others. And it's also a way of sort of unifying your sustainability program, of looking at, you know, water use, energy use, waste and recycling, and all of those things kind of through a common lens of carbon emissions. So it helps you assess all of the different aspects of sustainability kind of in a unified lens, looking at it through the issue of climate change and measuring it all in units of carbon, so you can sort of evaluate the impacts of the different aspects of sustainability that you're working on the climate. So that is a pretty useful tool for trying to prioritize, you know, do we work on a recycling program? Do we work on water conservation? Is energy conservation the most important thing? It helps you evaluate those things in a common language of carbon. So that is a pretty useful tool. And also as a communication tool to help different stakeholders in your university and your community understand how you're addressing climate change, what you're doing, what are your biggest sources of emissions, and what you're doing to address that. As you know, through the creation of your climate action plan, you're able to sort of tell your story of how your institution is becoming more sustainable. It has a very important aspect of being able to demonstrate results, being able to show how much carbon was reduced, how much money was saved through that process. And things like that are all very helpful parts of an inventory. And as well as I was saying before, you know, it helps planners look at different aspects of sustainability kind of through a common language of carbon emissions. So the most important thing, in order to do that, the inventory needs to be sort of a business as usual practice, something you do every year and something that's very visible to decision makers on your campus. So it's sort of not enough to just sort of do this and report to second nature, it's important to communicate with stakeholders around the inventory and how emissions reduction is going. If it was successful or not successful, are you on target to meet your climate action plan targets that you've set? Are you not? It also helps you, if you haven't created your climate action plan yet, to sort of look at the trajectory of your emissions and decide, okay, well, if we keep on the same trajectory for a certain number of years, where will we be in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? And, what could we do to bend the curve there and reduce our emissions over that time? So, because of that, because you want to make this something that's routine, something that's highly visible on your campus, it shouldn't be something that you think of as sort of an individual one-off chore. This is the thing we sort of have to do, and then we don't have to think about it for a while. It's really an iterative process, and the design and implementation of that iterative process is almost as important as the inventory itself, because you're reaching out to different members of your campus community. You're getting them involved in the process. You're helping them understand how the work that they do impacts climate change. And you're building relationships with them to provide data to you in the future, to pay attention to these issues of emissions when they make purchasing decisions or decisions that impact energy efficiency and things like that. So really, you want to always think of it as going through this iterative process of 3 stages. You're really designing the process of conducting an inventory. Then you're doing what we typically think of as the inventory. We're sort of gathering data. We're putting it into a carbon calculator. We're calculating our emissions, things like that. But then this is really the first stage in planning for mitigation. So you're using the results of your inventory to understand what policies or projects you might want to implement to help reduce those emissions. And on most of these slides, I have links to where you can find more information and more guidance on the topic. And I'll show a few slides at the end about our new resources and our new climate action planning guide, which is where these links take you, so you can kind of see what that is and what some of the content that's in there. So just some tips for putting together your carbon inventory team or your climate action planning team or just your sustainability team. As you get started, really make sure that you discuss the time and resources that are going to be required in doing this. It's not a tremendous burden, but it's not insignificant either. Especially doing a first inventory can be quite time consuming because there's a big learning curve when you're doing it for the first time. And that's another reason why it's important to do it sort of year after year. You're trying to make this routine, and each year you learn new things, you make new contacts, you have better relationships with the people who collect and provide the data necessary for doing this. So it's important to have that discussion up front with both people who might be providing data, but also people who are in the senior leadership of having a realistic conversation with them about what resources might be needed and how much time this could take. And the other aspect is really important to document the process. Who did you get data from? What types of data did they have? Were there any issues or inconsistency or inaccuracy in that data? Those kinds of things, so that the process can be replicated year after year after year. This is particularly important if you're if the inventory is, say, being done by students or sustainability office interns or something like that, where the person who's conducting the inventory in one year will not be the same person who conducts it the next year. It's really important to make as detailed a documentation of the process as possible so that it's easily replicable one year after the next. And so then going into, what goes into an inventory? What are we tracking? What do we need to track? And where do we find some of that information? So here is a diagram from the greenhouse gas protocol, which is sort of the protocol that most people use for greenhouse gas accounting in the United States. And I think throughout the world, pretty much. And Second Nature's process is mostly based on this protocol. So you can see that we're tracking. It's important to be tracking 6 different greenhouse gases. You're not looking just at carbon dioxide, but we're looking at the full suite of of greenhouse gases that are covered under the UN Convention on Climate Change. So that, this is why we measure things in carbon dioxide equivalents, because we're sort of trying to estimate the impact on the climate of all 6 of the greenhouse gases. And then the emissions are generally broken up into scopes. So you have scope 1 emissions, which are the direct emissions caused by your institution. So this is, fossil fuels burned directly on campus, in buildings and vehicles and things like that. This is also other things like agricultural chemicals used, livestock owned, things like that. So just the basic operations and processes of your direct campus. And then scope 2 is indirect. These are emissions that come from energy that is generated elsewhere and then purchased by the campus to be used in buildings or whatever. So this is typically, in most cases, this is going to be how much electricity did you consume and how is that electricity generated. So what type of greenhouse gas emissions does your regional grid produce when you buy electricity from them? And then scope 3 are indirect or induced emissions. So these are emissions caused by activities that are outside of the day-to-day, direct, emissions on campus. So these are things that occur because of universities' purchasing decisions or processes that happen either upstream or downstream and are induced by the activity of the university. In the ACU PCC, the only types of scope 3 emissions that are required to be reported are employee commuting, so that's faculty, staff, and students in the case of a university campus or college campus, and air travel, the air travel portion of business travel. So out of all of these potential scope 3 emission sources, the only ones that are required now under the carbon commitment are those 2 particular ones. Although many schools include quite a lot of other scope 3 emissions in their inventory, particularly the emissions caused by sewage treatment. So tracking your wastewater. A lot of campuses do that already because they have important water conservation programs, and so they're already sort of tracking how much water is used on campus and things like that. So it's fairly easy to just put that into the inventory. And also waste disposal is something that a lot of universities track because they already have extensive recycling programs. They may participate in Recyclemania or other programs like that, and so adding that type of information to the greenhouse gas inventory can be quite useful in that aspect of inventory, as I was talking about before, where you're able to sort of evaluate lots of different sustainability programs within sort of the common language of carbon emissions. So here is sort of a breakdown of the types of data that you'd need to gather in order to conduct an inventory. For scope 1, you're primarily looking for your on-campus fossil fuel consumption, so your natural gas bills, your fuel oil bills, all of that kind of stuff, as well as the university-owned vehicles. What's their energy consumption? Gasoline, diesel, biodiesel, those types of things. And then as well as agriculture and refrigerants and chemicals. Most campuses, if you're not a large agricultural school or you don't do a lot of landscaping or maintaining of sports fields or things like that, you might not have very much in the way in terms of agricultural emissions. And refrigerants and chemicals might not be something that is a large contributor to an inventory as well. So it might be something that you check on from time to time and to make sure that it's not exceeding 1 or 2% of your total inventory, your total emissions, but that it's not something you track every single year. Scope 2, there's your purchased energy, so this is primarily your electricity bill, number of kilowatt hours. And then scope 3, you're looking at just the commuting and air travel portions of the scope 3 for the current requirements of the carbon commitment. So how do our campuses typically conduct inventories? There's sort of 3 methods that people typically use. They'll do it in-house, sustainability office staff or facility staff conduct the inventory. Also, a lot of campuses organize this in a sustainability-related class or student project. So, either they have a student who's doing a research project or an internship, or they have a group of students in a class who work on this together. The other method is hiring a consultant to do this. The recommended method, we found that campuses that are sort of most successful in being able to replicate their inventory process from year to year and really take advantage of a lot of the benefits I've described are the campuses that are able to do the inventory in-house with staff, because that's really the way that you build those strong relationships between the person who's conducting the inventory and the people who provide the data. You have a very clear understanding of the process. It's very easy to replicate, and you have a very clear understanding of sort of the time and resources that are going to be needed. Students can be a very useful tool as well, as long as you have someone who is capable of sort of mentoring the students and training them year to year, because you have to basically train a new person each and every year. So, with those, with that person in place who's able to sort of oversee the process and make sure you get consistent results year to year, and you have consistent training and things like that. Doing it as a student project can also be a pretty successful way of doing it. And a consultant, while it might be very easy to do that in terms of saving of time and there's no learning curve since the consultant will already have the expertise on doing this, it can be an expensive process, and it can be very inconsistent because they often, a consultant coming in from outside of the campus often doesn't know the right people to speak to get the data. They might speak to different people in different years, be sort of getting incorrect data or inconsistent data. And it's also a closed process. It doesn't really engage your stakeholders around these issues. It becomes just something that's very external to the operating processes of the university, and a lot of people aren't familiar with that this is happening or that the results were produced, so they're not very engaged in understanding emissions, and therefore it makes it more difficult to try to engage people in reducing them. How long does it take to do an inventory? Could it be very time-consuming? Things like that. Generally, you can, once you kind of have gotten over the initial learning curve or done an inventory or two, you can usually do it in about 6 weeks or so. A few weeks of data collection and then a few weeks of doing the calculations and interpreting the results. And then it's important to spend some time after the data is collected and the results are generated to maybe write a report that you circulate or publish on the Sustainability Office website or something like that, as well as to communicate the results to key decision makers and important stakeholders and things like that. So while the inventory process itself might take as little as 6 weeks, you should probably spend a few more weeks communicating those results to stakeholders and sharing the results of the inventory as widely as possible. Let's move on. So a tool for in this graph here, graphic here, when you're completing the calculator, that is taking the data that you've gathered and entering it into a carbon calculator that will convert the the information that you've gathered, therms of natural gas, kilowatt hours of electricity, gallons of gasoline, all that kind of stuff into common units of carbon dioxide equivalent, metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So a common carbon calculator that a lot of our campuses use, I think something like 80% of signatories are using the campus carbon calculator. It was created in a partnership between the University of New Hampshire and a former nonprofit known as Clean Air Cool Planet. Clean Air Cool Planet has now sort of remerged with the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute, and the calculator is maintained there. There's both an Excel version and a web-based version called Carbon Map. So this is a very handy tool for calculating your campus emissions. And now I'm just going to quickly, for the next few minutes, move into some tips about doing inventories, some things that people struggle with, a lot of the common questions we get. I'll try to go through this quickly to leave some time for questions at the end, and also to give you a bit of a glimpse at some of our new resources that we have for helping you fulfill the commitments. So one of the biggest areas that people struggle with are the Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are pretty straightforward to calculate. You get your electric bill, you get your bill from the gas company, and you enter that into the carbon calculator and you're all set. Scope 3 emissions tend to require a lot more estimates and a lot more sort of guesswork and gathering of different data. So in terms of commuting, one of the things that people commonly do is use a survey of commuters to get the information, and that is important, and there's a lot of information that you might need that really the only good way to get it is through a survey, but surveys are very complicated, very time-consuming. They'll add quite a lot of time to the time it requires to do an inventory, like I showed in that other graph. That could add 2 or 3 weeks at least onto that process by needing to conduct a commuter survey. So there's some shortcuts that you can do. Maybe you only conduct the survey every 5 years or something, and in the intervening years you kind of make some estimates, some interpolations about your commuting patterns, so that you don't have to do a survey every single year. So what you really need to calculate your commuting emissions is vehicle miles traveled. So how many miles have been traveled by vehicles to and from your campus throughout the year. So this is the piece of data that you're going to drop into the carbon calculator in the same way that you would drop in your electricity consumption or something like that. So this is the value that you need, this VMT. So in order to estimate that, you really need to gather several different pieces of data. So you need to know something about how many commuters you have, and how they're coming to the campus. Are they driving alone? Are they carpooling? Are they biking, walking, etc.? So really single occupancy vehicles and carpools are going to be driving your carbon emissions, as well as smaller contribution from public transit and things like that, since walkers and bikers and people who live on campus aren't really going to be contributing any carbon to your commuting footprint. You need to know where are these commuters coming from on average, how far are they going each time they come to campus, and how often. So those are the pieces of data that you'll need to estimate your VMT. And there's a lot of ways that you can go about estimating or modeling some of those pieces of data without doing a survey. So you can look at how many of your students live on campus. Okay, so those people, we can assume they're walkers. So we won't be including the on-campus students in the inventory. You can look at the number of parking passes sold to get an idea of sort of how many commuters you might have. Same with different modes of transit. So you can estimate based on that. And for a number of days, really just look at your academic calendar, and you can sort of make some assumptions based on your academic calendar and your academic schedule. Do students typically have classes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or maybe just Tuesday, Thursday? So are they coming 5 days a week, or 3 days, or 2 days? The same for faculty. Are they, do most faculty only teach 1 or 2 classes? They might not be on campus unless they're teaching, or you might have a situation where most of your faculty is on campus every single day, doing research even when they're not teaching, things like that. And staff are typically 5-day, in the office 5 days a week. So you can make estimates on that based on your academic calendar, and then sort of, okay, how many days are classes in session, and figure that out. Many campuses also maintain databases of their employees and students' addresses. So you can gather the zip codes from your human resources office or the registrar or something, and then based on the zip codes and Google Maps, you're able to sort of really quickly estimate average commute distances. So how many people live in each zip code, and how far away is the center of that zip code from the center of our campus, things like that. That helps you get commute distance rather easily if you're able to collect that anonymous zip code data from HR. And if you're really stuck and you can't do a survey and you can't make any of these other estimates, the Census Department collects a lot of data on commuting. It's called ride to work or something, this data set that the Census Bureau generates. So you can find a lot of information about, sort of average distances in your area, average number of commuters, how frequently people commute, things like that. So you can kind of use that as sort of a proxy default data for your commuting profile if you're not able to generate one in any other way. Air travel similarly tends to be something that's really difficult for people to collect without a survey. Some campuses have, whenever someone submits a reimbursement for an airfare, that they have to list which airport they left from and which airport they landed at. And then if you have all that data, then you have direct number of miles flown. But that's pretty rare. Most campuses are in a situation where they don't have that data, and so you have to estimate it or model it in some other way. So the easiest way to do that is to look at the amount of money that was spent on airfare reimbursements. And then you can use this Department of Transportation, Bureau of Transportation Statistics report that will sort of tell you, how many miles on average does an airline domestic airline travel per dollar spent. So then you have a pretty good estimate of like, okay, so we spent, X thousands of dollars on air travel, which translates to, X thousand of miles of airplane trips. Also, if your university's policy is that anyone who's purchasing airfare has to use a specific campus credit card purchase, a purchase card or a specific departmental credit card, you can easily get the reports about, how much money was spent directly from that credit card company's reports. Or if the campus policy is that all flights have to be booked through a particular on-campus travel agency, they may have a report of what travel was conducted that year. So those are just some places that you can find to help work on Scope 3 emissions, which tends to be the most difficult and time-consuming part of doing an inventory. And then the final step, once your inventory is completed, to submit that to Second Nature, you use the Second Nature reporting system. And there's various links on this slide to the reporting system. It's all online, so you go to reporting.secondnature.org. You click on a report. Create a new greenhouse gas inventory report for 2015, which will be the one that you'll be submitting on January 15th, 2016. So that will be your 2015 report. So you create a new report and then go in and edit that new 2015 report, and you'll see all of the different fields there to enter, how much Scope 1 emissions do we have, Scope 2, Scope 3, and various other questions related to how you conducted your inventory and is it, verified by a third party and all that kind of stuff. So there are reporting instructions as well on the reporting system. I have the link there, so that kind of, it's a much more sort of step-by-step how you use the reporting system, where you log in, how to create those different reports. And we also have the reporting@secondnature.org email address, so if you have any questions about conducting your inventory or how do you submit it to Second Nature or things like that, that is the best contact to reach out to, since many of our staff will monitor that account and be able to help you get your questions answered. So I want to just quickly move on from that a little bit and show you the new climate guidance on our new website. Along with the update in the commitment, we've also refurbished our website. We have a lot of new material there, and most of it is on, if you follow this link to secondnature.org/climate-guidance, you'll find all of the tools and information we have on implementing the commitments on your campus. This is the web page itself, screen capture of it. So you have basically 4 pieces of guidance. We have the full Sustainability and Climate Action Planning Guide. It's many hundreds of pages of detailed guidance on implementing sustainability actions on your campus. We have the commitment implementation guide, which follows the text of the commitment itself, much more detailed. So, the commitments will say, in year one, you need to create a sustainability planning group on your campus. So the commitments guide will then have sort of a few paragraphs of information about how you might go about doing that, as well as links back to the full sustainability planning and climate action guide where you can get much more detailed information. So that commitments implementation guide is kind of like a quick start guide if you're just sort of, need a quick refresher, or you're just jumping in and you need to kind of get a quick overview of what you might need to do. And then we have the text of the commitments themselves and under climate leadership commitments. And then we have an extensive FAQ of questions that we commonly get. And that all links back to the sustainability planning and climate action guide as well. So it gives you the answer to the question, as well as where you could go to find more detailed information on that. And here is what, if you click on the Sustainability Planning and Climate Action Guide, here is what you will get. It's basically organized into two sections. One is sort of the foundations for action. So these are sort of the things that any campus would need to do, things that you're really going to have to do no matter what types of climate action you might be taking, whether you're working on the carbon commitment or the resilience commitment, or just any sustainability planning in general. So you need to organize your team. You need to be able to sort of assess where your campus is and try to prioritize some key actions, and you'll need to be able to measure progress as you go. And then the other section is the different building blocks for climate action. So this is more focused on particular topics. So, are you looking to implement the carbon commitment? You're really thinking about carbon management and mitigation actions, or are you working primarily on resilience or academics financing, or data collection and evaluation? So these are more specific topics as opposed to sort of the general foundations for taking action. So and with that, I want to spend the rest of the time answering questions that you may have submitted. And if you have any other questions about reporting or conducting inventories, here is that email address again, reporting@secondnature.org. So.
Thank you, Brett, for that great presentation. We have been getting some questions from the audience, and let me see. Some of them are stuff that's covered by your presentation so far, but one that we had here was regarding how nuanced the data that you use, for example, for commuting, need to be.
Yeah, so going back to the scopes of an inventory, this is another reason why we sort of separate emissions into scopes. So scope 1, your direct emissions, that is something that you should be directly measuring. You should know exactly how many therms of natural gas you consumed, or how many gallons of gasoline were used in the campus fleet. That's very direct and very measurable. Same with scope 2. I mean, the exact number of kilowatt hours you consumed, and then the only estimates you're making, the only sort of uncertainties are, okay, well, what types of power plants are on our grid? We sort of have to estimate that, and the carbon calculator will do that for you. But when you're dealing with scope 3 and direct emissions, there's a lot more modeling and assumptions and sort of, educated guesses and things that go into that, and that's okay. That's the nature of indirect emissions. It's why sort of direct emissions we're sort of saying okay, that's measured emissions, and then when you get all the way out to indirect or induced emissions, that's much more subjective. You're sort of making a lot of assumptions in there. So the types of data that you need are things that you can use to approximate. Okay, so we think that most students probably come to campus 2 days a week. Like, that's based on the following set of things that we know about our academic calendar and our student body and this, that, and the other thing. But you may not know that number exactly. You may have to guess or estimate. And even with a survey, even if you ask a certain percentage of your student body, I mean, that data is only as good as sort of the statistical robustness of that survey and the self-reported data that you're getting from people. Are they confused? Did they remember correctly? Are they being honest? So the data can be a lot more, not as precise as the data that you might have in a Scope 1 section of your inventory.
That makes sense. And another question we have here, if you have a new sustainability team, how long might it take to complete a greenhouse gas inventory together for the first time? Can you give a kind of an estimate, in your opinion, for what might be the low estimate and the high estimate?
Yeah, I mean, I think if thinking sort of of the academic year, if you kind of got your team together, maybe, the beginning of the summer, at some point over the summer, a couple times, and, worked through the summer a little bit, maybe not, very much, since, people are on vacation and traveling and whatnot, and then through the fall semester, that should be more than enough time to be able to report in January. And then as your team gets more sophisticated and more used to working with each other and knows, exactly where to put their fingers on all of that data, then you can really, if you start by like September, end of September, beginning of October, whatever, it should be no problem at all to get things done by January once you're used to doing it.
And there's some questions here about fuel consumption. So when you are purchasing fuel for your campus fleet from a regular gas station, is that Scope 3 or Scope 1?
That's Scope 1. If it's a university-owned vehicle, that counts as a Scope 1 emission.
Great. What about, you were talking earlier about the online tool, Carbon Map, and the calculator. Is that, did you mention if that was free? That was one of the questions that we had about.
Yeah, it's currently free. I don't think, I'm not as familiar with Carbon Map, but the Excel version, you just sort of enter in your information about your campus and your name and your email address, and they'll email you a link to download the Excel file. It's all free.
Is it available for any kind of institution, whether it's higher education or K through 12?
Yeah, anyone can use it. It's when you go to the the full greenhouse gas protocol, they're really creating this protocol for corporations in the United States. And what Clean Air, Cool Planet and University of New Hampshire have done is kind of taken all of the complexity in this protocol and kind of found the parts that are most relevant to an institution of higher education. So if you're filtering that down to a K through 12 institution that maybe doesn't have a campus, some boarding schools have a campus. It's very similar to a university or college campus, but some K through 12 schools that don't have residential things or just have a building or two, not like a full campus, you might find the campus carbon calculator even has quite a lot of other pieces of data in it that you don't really need. Like you might not be using the agricultural pieces, or you might not really be dealing with air travel or things like that. So you can certainly use it for other types of organizations, but you might find that it even has more sort of bells and whistles than you need.
Do you have any advice for people who want to account for the carbon capture of trees that may have been planted during the reporting period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the campus carbon calculator will let you make some estimates on that based on sort of the number of acres and the sort of average uptake in your area. It gets into a challenging issue though, because you're not it gets into kind of a very fine line between new sequestration that's happening and then sequestration that's simply stored in those trees. That's not what's called additional. It's not newly taken out of the atmosphere. So that is kind of a whole other area that can be kind of complicated, and there's a lot of subtlety in that. So that's kind of a more detailed question. So I'd encourage if you wanted more information to just write to us and we can answer that in more detail.
Sounds good. What about any recommendations for guides or sites to use for conversions?
Hmm. Yeah. The campus carbon calculator has quite a few conversions in there. Also, I think the EPA and their greenhouse gas section has conversions and things. So you're talking about like converting, therms to MMBTU and that kind of stuff. I think, Wolfram Alpha and just a Google search and things like that will find plenty of conversion tools. So.
Here's an interesting question that we also received. It says, as we get better at tracking Scope 3 emissions, we appear to be increasing in overall greenhouse gas emissions because we are including more data. Is there a way to adjust the baseline to reflect our improved accounting methods? We are reporting more emissions, but not necessarily emitting more greenhouse gases.
Right. Yeah. So you'll the best thing to do would just be to project, like take your most recent year, where you have the most sophisticated Scope 3 accounting, and then think about backcasting that. Okay, so can we assume that there were, do we think there were any major changes in our patterns of Scope 3 emissions in previous years, or have they just been more or less constant? Think about, well, what kinds of things are we measuring? And were those things increasing or decreasing over time? Maybe if you have two years of really good Scope 3 accounting, you can just calculate the slope of that line and then backcast that way using the slope of the rate of change that between the 2 years that you're confident in. Or you might say, okay, we've measured really well in 2015, and we don't really have any strong reason to believe that 2010 was really any different than 2015. So we're just going to sort of backcast our constant value from the year we were really good at our inventory back into the past, and then you'll have a baseline in the past that's comparable with your emissions currently.
Thank you. This one's more of a process question. How do you make sure to pass down information to creating a continuity in your reporting at your institution?
Yeah, the best way is to really keep a very detailed journal. I talked to such and such a person on this date, and they were able to supply me with the following pieces of data, and from that I estimated this. So just sort of keeping a journal of where you got your data, any calculations or manipulations of that data you had to do after you got it from the person who collected it. Things like that. And then if you have, if you're doing it in-house and you have a staff member who's working on it from year to year to year, just that person's, their relationships with other people on the team, their institutional memory, things like that are really great sort of informal ways of doing it. But, and if you have a class, maybe at the end of the semester, the class has to kind of write up a 5-page paper of how they conducted the inventory or whatever, and those documents are available the next semester when you have a different set of students doing it, and you can over time sort of build up a collection of these types of documents, and it makes whoever is working on the inventory has this sort of long history of detailed documents saying how the inventory was conducted.
Thank you. So it sounds like travel is one of those big things that people have difficulty tracking and accounting for in their inventories. One of the questions that we got was, if they are not tracking travel consistently in their institution, should they still be including that information in their inventories?
Yeah, the best thing to do is to track it when you can, and then interpolate in the years when you can't. Particularly commuting emissions. Unless there's a major change in something that would influence commuting habits, they tend to shift very slowly, something over like a 5-year period. Even if you're doing a lot of education and outreach, trying to get people to carpool, you're giving them incentives to commute to campus less, you're increasing parking fees or something like that, those policies still can take 3, 4, 5 years to really move the needle on commuting emissions. So if you're not doing anything like that, and there's not major fluctuations fluctuations in gas prices, or there's not, major changes in your local transportation infrastructure, like, there's not a whole, new interstate or something that's being built, or a road, an important transit artery near campus being widened or something like that, you're probably not going to see very much variation in commuter habits from year to year to year. So, if you only are able to survey like, 1 year and then you're not able to do it again for like 3 or 5 years, chances are there's not going to be a whole lot of change in commuting emissions, over those years, unless there was a major change in your transportation infrastructure.
Thank you. So you gave in the beginning a good introduction to recent changes at Second Nature and for the climate leadership commitments. One of the questions that we got was whether those changes imply any changes in the greenhouse gas reporting specifically.
Currently, they don't. Currently, the reporting is the same. The only change is that we've made it annual. It used to be biannual. And we found that more than 75% of our institutions already report on an annual basis. And we've also heard a lot of feedback from our campuses that sort of doing it on this kind of, semi-regular basis is actually really a challenge, because, those contacts with the data providers get lost, or you have to, rebuild those relationships all over again. Why am I giving you this data? What is this for? What are we doing? So we found that most people already do it annually, and there's quite a lot of problems not doing it annually. It also, if you do it annually, it fulfills these roles that I talked about a little bit better. You have a consistent management tool. You can look at it every year, see how you're doing. When you're communicating with decision makers, they kind of get used to seeing it every year. Like, oh yeah, we got to look at that greenhouse gas inventory. Like, it just becomes more routine and more visible, and people on campus are sort of more familiar with doing it. So that's why we made the decision to make it an annual part of the commitments. So that's really the only major thing that's changed in our reporting procedures.
Thank you. We have another travel question for you. When you are tracking team travel by plane, do you divide the total number of people by the miles traveled, or is each person responsible for the greenhouse gases if he or she was flying on their own?
Yeah, it's usually per, it's passenger mile. So you're sort of accounting for the contribution of each person on that plane. So what's basically happening when you're making those estimations is you're taking, the total emissions of that plane, you're dividing it by the number of people, and then you're saying, okay, so that's my portion that I contributed to my institution's greenhouse gas profile. So if you have like 10 people on the plane, then you multiply that by 10. So, when you do that calculation of sort of the, dollars spent on travel, how many miles per dollar, that's on a per person basis. So if you have more than one traveler, then you have to account for each of those travelers individually.
Here's another interesting one that we got. So with the calculator, do you have any idea if it can manage tracking or calculating things for multiple campuses that are perhaps in different states or even different countries?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways you could do that. The easiest thing to think about is who's paying the energy bills for the campus. If they're being paid in a central location for all of those campuses, then you might want to aggregate the emissions from all of those campuses into one calculator. Because really, if we go back to sort of why are we doing this whole thing in the first place, this sort of purpose of an inventory, you're trying to make management decisions that will help you reduce emissions. So if everything for all these different campuses is managed in a central location, that manager is going to want to see sort of a full picture of the impacts of purchasing and fuel use and energy use decisions. But if each of those campuses has its own separate energy managers, it's getting its own energy bills, it's separate. You might want to just do an inventory for each one individually because it's a little bit easier for the decision makers at that site to kind of understand what's happening to their carbon emissions if they have an inventory that only covers their one particular location. The biggest problem that you're going to have for multiple locations is with your Scope 2 emissions, because those are typically pegged to your regional electric grid. So, you know, if you have if you purchase electricity in the Northwest, that is a very, very different emissions profile than electricity produced in the Southeast. So if you have campuses in different regions of the country, that is a challenge to really aggregate your Scope 2 emissions. You might wind up doing separate calculations for campuses based on that.
And I think we have time for one last question here. This one is about the upcoming reporting deadline, January 2016, and if you're using the online calculator to calculate all this kind of information you need for your greenhouse gas inventory, would that pretty much cover what you would need, or is there anything additional that you would need to do in order to complete or meet that reporting submission deadline on January 2016?
Yeah, no, that should be it. I mean, you have to take the information that comes out of the carbon calculator and enter it into Second Nature's reporting system. And for doing that, but it's, you know, it should only take, you know, 15 or 20 minutes, because you basically sort of look at, okay, what were the results from our carbon calculator? Okay, I'm going to type them into the Second Nature website and hit enter. So that's the only additional step that's really required, is the reporting step after you've done the carbon calculator.
And if you still feel like you have some questions about what your institution has due coming up on January, or you're still confused about how to, you know, get started with your reporting specifically, then we really encourage you to write to the email that's on the screen right now, reporting@secondnature.org, and our team will be happy to help you with any questions that you have. So in these last couple of minutes, are there any final recommendations that you'd like to share?
Not really. I guess the only other thing to add would be, if you have questions about using the campus carbon calculator, the University of New Hampshire is the best way to get answers to that. We're generally familiar with their calculator, and we've used it a lot, and we can kind of answer basic questions about it. But every time a new version comes out, it's slightly different and things like that. And so we are sort of behind the curve a little bit. That they would, I think it's. I think they have an email address that's like carbon@unh.edu or something like that. You can find it from the link that I included here. These links would take you to their help page as well. So you could email them if you had a really technical question of, like, on this particular worksheet in the Excel tool, in cell 35, I'm entering something and it doesn't seem like it's calculating correctly or whatever. Those kinds of questions, they're much better at answering than we are.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and the recording and the slides will be shared with all of the registrants in the days following this presentation. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.